So this week we are studying China. So what we are doing for the last 1 week and a few weeks going forward, we are looking at various case studies of what we know as social medicine and universal healthcare models. Last week or the week before the Easter break, we studied Soviet Russia and how that became a model for healthcare systems elsewhere. This week, we are focusing on China. And it's a unique system of barefoot doctors that we will be studying that developed in China. And it developed after the Cultural Revolution. And it's unique because it's a very Chinese model. It's a first model of social medicine in Asia. So it has this own cultural geographical significance, that it's an Asian example or experiment on social medicine. But it's also a product of what is known as Cultural Revolution, which I will talk about. So the main question that we will have in this class this week is that the barefoot doctor model that we will study, is it a very Chinese Cultural Revolution institution that is uniquely Chinese, or is it a Chinese institution nevertheless, but it is also an example of social medicine, a particular example of social medicine. So we'll kind of debate whether it's very unique or it's actually a model of wider use, and we'll end the class in debating whether there's a future of this model. The barefoot doctor model was discontinued in 1981, if I'm not incorrect. So it's been quite a few years, in fact decades, of the barefoot doctor not being functioning. But is there a future of the barefoot doctors given the kind of health challenges we are facing today? Is something, and that is where you take that kind of very Chinese institution to a much more global acceptance and use. So what is the future of barefoot doctors? So there will be two lectures as usual. And what I will do is, in the first lecture, I will just introduce the history of the Cultural Revolution in China and Chinese healthcare systems, within which barefoot doctors was an important part. And in the second lecture, I will have a more focused debate about this question of whether the barefoot doctors is an uniquely Chinese institution, or is it a product of Cultural Revolution, which I've talked about. And I will deliberate a bit about the future of barefoot doctors, because a lot of our class is talking about not just what happened in the past, but what is the future of our healthcare systems. As I started the class talking about the fifth wave, we are kind of at the beginning of what is known as the fifth wave, which we'll study a few weeks later. That the fifth wave will look very different to what the healthcare systems have looked as before. So we will use this barefoot doctors model in debating what is the future of healthcare systems and whether barefoot doctors have a future in that new model. So if I just can share my PowerPoint. Hopefully you can all see the PowerPoint now. So the barefoot doctors is, in one word, is a kind of an unique Chinese institution, which literally meant that students who were given very basic medical training uh, would be sent to remote rural areas to serve as kind of an intermediary between the big hospitals, the cities, the doctors, and the rural populations. Because China, at the time of the Cultural Revolution, was a vastly poor and rural country with almost no healthcare systems. So the barefoot doctors, the model was developed as a way of connecting the cities, the healthcare systems, the established healthcare systems, and the rural areas. And they were called barefoot doctors almost because they were not literally all barefoot, um, but it was kind of a loving way of referring to them as doctors without institutional baggage. They would walk everywhere. So that kind of a new mode of healthcare system that they represented, that the Barefoot almost was against the kind of institutional baggages that doctors had, that these were freer people who would meet and live with the rural people and look after them. So it's a more community based medicine model that we developed. And what is very interesting is, if you remember the 1978 Alma Ata Declaration, and that the model of Alma-Ata Declaration was primary healthcare systems, that you should have decentered primary healthcare systems, and the Barefoot Doctors was used as one of the important models of doing that. In that model, it's unfortunate that the 1978 Alma-Ata Declaration was made, and by 1981 the Barefoot Doctor scheme was abolished in China because of China's own internal changes. China's economy was changing. More market-driven economy was being introduced in the 80s. The 80s change in China. But the Barefoot Doctor, for the moment to remember, became a model for rural healthcare systems in the 1970s and 80s. So there are three themes that I will study throughout the two lectures. The first is the Cultural Revolution in China. And second is rural healthcare systems in China, of which the Barefoot Doctor was an important part of. And the third is a very important part of the entire Cultural Revolution and Chinese medicine, is propaganda, of how the Barefoot Doctors kind of represented the Cultural Revolution of China in terms of propaganda, and in terms of what the new Chinese identity was about, how it was reinventing itself as a new nation, new culture, new country. And the Barefoot Doctors was a very important part of that reinvention of China as a modern nation. So, briefly, the Cultural Revolution. As you may know, the 1966 to 1976 was a period of what is known as the Cultural Revolution of China. It's interesting to see that how the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 shaped healthcare systems in Soviet Russia. It is important to see that how the Cultural Revolution of China, which I'm talking about here, shaped Chinese medicine in the 1960s and 70s. And we'll see in the following week on Cuba how the Cuban Revolution also shaped Cuban public health systems. So it is interesting to compare how revolutions or how revolutionary changes have been important in bringing about healthcare system changes in different countries. So the Cultural Revolution sought to define a new and modern China against its colonial and feudal past. So the main focus, the main thrust of the Cultural Revolution was that we need to have a cultural change. We need to have an economic change, but it's based on a cultural change as well. That China was laden down or suffering from its feudal and colonial past, and the need was to break away from that colonial past, to break away from its old institutions, and to create a completely new nation and a completely new cultural identity. So there's a very important cultural change that was brought about in that through the revolution. So modernity, new cultural identity, and socio-economic reconstruction of China were the main facets of the Cultural Revolution. That it's a new nation, a new modernity, and a new kind of identity. It was also very authoritarian, that it's a revolution that was brought about not by the people as such, by the state. It's a state, the Chinese government-based revolution. And it's interesting, when a revolution is introduced by a government, it's very different from a revolution that is actually brought about by the people. So it's an important point to remember that it is a state-oriented, state-based revolution. So it was very authoritarian, and it was based on the Red Army. And there's an image of the Red Army here. And a band of loyal workers formed by Mao Zedong, who was the supreme leader of the Cultural Revolution. And this banner was very important: clear away every evil habits of the old society. So it's against the evil habits of the old society, China's own looking at itself very closely, at its own culture, and needing to change, looking at its own identity, own past, and needing to change. And historian Kim Taylor describes that in 1960s and 70s, during the period of Cultural Revolution, China politically and culturally withdrew into itself. It kind of lost in touch with the world, because it was a period when it was looking at itself closely and changing itself closely. So it's a period when Chinese culture, Chinese economy became very inward looking, and it tried to grasp or grapple with its own change, not within a wider global world, but within a very internal looking mode. So, what is useful to remember here that one, the Cultural Revolution was a very internal revolution. It is a closed revolution within China. Second, um, the various medical institutions that developed uh, from that cultural revolution, like the traditional Chinese medicine, which we'll talk about also, and the barefoot doctors, were products of that inward looking phase. It was a product of when China was looking within itself, which meant that it had a very Chinese identity. It had a very cultural revolution identity. It wasn't a global identity. Like unlike the Soviet medicine, which where people visited and took it as a model, the barefoot doctors appeared as a very Chinese way of achieving modernity, as the cultural revolution was, which might give the impression that it is a very uniquely Chinese model. But what is important for us to think is that although it was developed, the barefoot doctor scheme, within that phase of inwardness of Chinese culture and economy, it did have wider implications. It did take messages from the wider changes that it was happening in healthcare systems, and it did have important messages for the wider world. So that's an important point to remember. Anyway, for the moment, that was the Cultural Revolution. It was an internal phase of intense political and cultural change in China. So, as part of the Cultural Revolution and the search for new identity, the Chinese government established primary healthcare systems and sought to revitalize traditional Chinese medicine. So, as a part of its own change, that we need our own Chinese medicine. We don't want Western medicine. We need our own Chinese medicine. So the old needs to be changed into the new. So the old Chinese medicine needed to be changed into the new Chinese medicine. Chinese doctors and the Chinese government invented a new Chinese medicine by unifying various local folk medical traditions under one as part of the Cultural Revolution. Thus, traditional Chinese medicine was reformulated in response to Western medicine during the Cultural Revolution. This new medicine was tested in laboratories, drugs were manufactured in large factories, and dispensed by doctors in modern hospitals. So, what China did was that for our nation, we need our own medicine. For our own cultural change, we need our own new medicine. So, it changed various kinds of folk rural medical practices that existed in different parts of China, brought them together, codified them, started manufacturing them in large scale manufacturing pharmaceutical companies or factories, and distributing them to the hospital. So it in a way it was almost uh, a copy or a mimicking of what Western drug was, but in a Chinese concept. So it's Chinese practices, Chinese ingredients, Chinese medical theories of bodies and of drugs, and within that format. So in the format, it was like the West, but in the content it was the Chinese medicine. So it's called it came to be known as the traditional Chinese medicine. What is important to remember that it is, although it is called a traditional Chinese medicine, it is a new tradition. It was not the old tradition, because old traditions, the folk traditions, were changed to be made into one modern medicine. So it's a very cultural revolution kind of twist, that you take the old and reinvent entirely into the new and still call it old. But it is no longer the old because it has been reinvented into a new form of medicine. I'm not going into the great details of the Chinese traditional medicine, or TCM as it is called. If you are interested in TCM and the history, please let me know, and I'll be very happy to provide you new readings with it. But um, the TCM or the emergence, and you probably know a lot about Chinese traditional medicines and the drugs available even in this country, and the even in our institutions. The traditional Chinese medicine is quite common now, but it's a product of the Cultural Revolution that I've referred to before. The other challenge, so one was solving the problems of drugs, the solving the access availability of drugs. The other, which is a classic social medicine problem, is access that China faced. That how do you provide healthcare? You can manufacture drugs in the factories. You can reinvent medical formulas of old formulas into new ones. But how do you actually provide those to the huge population? China, as you know, was a huge country and it still is a huge country with a large population and very much rural. 80% of the population in China at the time of the Cultural Revolution lived in rural areas. So the main challenge in front of the Chinese government at the time of the Cultural Revolution was access, and particularly rural access. So the Cultural Revolution also marked the inauguration of a massive public health initiative in China, which had far-reaching consequences for medical development of the world's most populous country. So it undertook that massive project of trying to provide rural healthcare. On June the 26th, 1965, Chairman Mao Zedong, in his instruction on rural health work, criticized the bias of health resource allocation towards urban cities and urged expansion to efforts to emphasize rural healthcare. So Mao was very keen on rural healthcare system. It is, you can see that it is part of the Cultural Revolution, but it has echoes of social medicine. What happened in Russia, what happened in other parts of the world. That we have to expand the access to health as a key part. And on the time of the Cultural Revolution, as I said, 80% of the population of China lived in rural areas. So the Chinese state developed a rural medical program that was inspired by the principles of revolutionary socialism. So it is actually using revolutionary socialism as developing a rural healthcare system. It fitted the idea of a new nation and a new form of healthcare, but using traditional rural connections. So it's a rural country. It will use those rural networks that existed for centuries, but through a new mode. And the new mode was barefoot doctors. So the barefoot doctor was an attempt by the Chinese government to solve the basic healthcare problems of rural areas through political mobilization. The barefoot doctors recruited from the rural areas received initial training of 3 to 6 months, and after a period of practice received additional training. This was in very varied forms, including training group by group and individual training by qualified doctors. So they would receive basic training, they would go back and receive some more training, but essentially they would be working in the rural areas, serving the rural communities. These peasant doctors offer treatment while doing farm work. So they would be actually embedded within the farming communities. They would be part of the farming communities. They would not be just visitors coming and giving drugs and going away. They would be embedded as community healthcare workers. So it's actually a model of community healthcare systems, that they are part of that rural community. And the peasants affectionately call them barefoot doctors. So they are kind of, barefoot means, peasants are barefoot. So they are one of us, but they're also doctors. So they're not just peasants, they're also healthcare workers. So it's almost a model of integrating medical profession within the rural community systems. So in this new system, Western medicine was not only available, but also made affordable by villagers for the first time. The Barefoot Doctor program provided the first real context in which Chinese and Western medicine would compete at the village level. So one of the interesting factors is the barefoot doctors often prescribed or administered not just Chinese medicine, but Western medicine, antibiotics and other forms. So they were the first mode through which Western medicine actually spread within China, because they would prescribe Western medicine because it's probably easier to prescribe and useful in various kinds of healthcare systems. So together with medical knowledge and pharmaceuticals, the healing technologies of Western medicine was gradually entered the villages. And from the early 1950s onwards, by the 1970s, a variety of different methods were applied by the barefoot doctors, including Chinese herbal medicine, acupuncture, and Western medicine. Although the barefoot doctors also employed Chinese medicine, they tended to increasingly apply Western medical instruments and prescribe Western drugs. The barefoot doctors is an interesting model. As I said, it's a rural embedded kind of healthcare system, but they're using both traditional Chinese drugs, but also Western drugs, because in many kind of crisis and surgical situations that they would be faced with, Western medicine was probably more useful for them to use. So they did not make too much of distinction between what is traditional and what is Western. They would use what is useful. It's a very practical model of a healthcare system, which is usually a good model of healthcare system. Rather than our consolidating traditional Chinese medicine, as purported by the government propaganda, the Barefoot Doctor program introduced modern Western medicine to China. So there's a kind of a duality that the Chinese government wanted them to be very Chinese institution, but they essentially were administering Western medicine in rural situations. And there are few examples of people who had served as doctors in barefoot doctors. Zhingzhu Liu, I can't pronounce the name correctly, the program director at the Fogarty International Center, because as you know, the barefoot doctor scheme was abolished in 1981. So these various people doctors who served as barefoot doctors are working somewhere else now in many cases in the US, and they have now shared their experiences of barefoot doctors. And Liu talks about being a barefoot doctor from 1975 to 1977, towards the middle of that phase. Age 19, he was taken away from his senior secondary school to participate in the drive to equip people with practical skills. So this would be a classic case that at the age of 19, high school, he would be just taken away from that, trained in basic medicine, and sent to the villages. So the country's health bureau organized medical training in my school and provided free accommodation and food. The trainers were the best from the country's central hospital in various fields. So the best doctors would be brought in, and they would train these very young people in medicine. Many of the doctors were dispatched from the urban hospitals during the down to countryside movement, when Mao decreed privileged urban youth to go to rural areas to learn from workers and farmers, and showed great professionalism. They were very good trainers and doctors. The other is Gordon Liu, and who another doctor who's a professor of economics at Peking University now, and he's talked about in the same period as Liu. After graduating in 1975, I became a barefoot doctor at the Shijiazhuang, I can't pronounce, Shijiazhuang commune in northwestern Shandong province, south of Beijing, serving 1,800 residents. Despite the knowledge I learned from the strict training, the conditions and equipments in the countryside were very limited. I was given only a bag of some basic medicine with 2 syringes and 10 noodles. There's a BBC short documentary on the barefoot doctors, and from which I've got this information. And I will just share that short clip of Gordon Liu interview. Just bear with me. I'll have to stop the share and share the other. Hopefully you can see it now.
I became a barefoot doctor after I graduated from high school, simply because I was one of the most educated young person. I had no any training, any experience, knowledge in medicine whatsoever.
Chairman Mao says the sick must be healed. He's caused a real shake-up in China's health services.
Every commune, they say, now has hospitals and clinics, providing medical attention where there was none before. Perhaps the most striking development has been the training of a vast corps of barefoot doctors.
They have their farm work to do as well, and their training's limited. But even if you can teach people simple hygiene, it saves countless lives.
We provide very basic services to our villagers, mostly like a common cold conditions, infections, diarrhea, things like that. Barefoot doctor simply described that sometimes we had to take shoes off to work in a farmland. We were not always barefoot. I do have shoes. I started Barefoot Doctor to not only treat the people, but also treat animals. We have horses, we have pigs. So actually in the beginning, I practiced the injection work by giving a shot to pigs to horses. It's not as difficult as if I do this job for human. Of course, all my people in the village believe in my care would be good enough for them to take care of their health. Because if I was not there for their health care, what would be or who would be there otherwise? No one. There was one case I still remember. One of my relatives, she had a teeth problem, and then she had to go to the county hospital. And she returned to the village, and she still felt very, very painful. So then she said, "My little brother, can you do something for me?" And I said, "Yeah, let me give it a try." I went back to the Chinese medicine books I have. I read the relevant chapters for like a dental care. I said, "Look, can't you try this prescription?" After like 3 or 4 days, and her problem was gone. That news was just out to the whole village. So this little kid can do something much better than county hospital. So I was very, very proud of it.
The big epidemics have been largely checked. A doctor said, rather smugly I thought, the only venereal disease cases we get in China now are those that come over the border from Hong Kong. In China, we've stamped it out.
So I'm just stopping the share and go back to my PowerPoint. So as you saw from this short clip, and I hope you got the audio, if you didn't, just click on the photo image and that will take you to the BBC website where I took the clip from. But you saw that it was a very practical mode. These were not really doctors. They were just had some very basic idea of medicine, and they would have to go back and check the books or consult somebody else, come back and treat the people. So it was a very organic kind of a model that was established and that served in that period in a very vast way the rural healthcare systems. Sorry, just hope. So if you are interested in the Barefoot Doctors, this is a link to a documentary that was made in I think it was late 1970s. A documentary was made, a much larger documentary on the Barefoot Doctors in China and what kind of medical training they received, what kind of medical situations they dealt with. And it's a very interesting documentary. It's quite a well-made documentary. It's not too much of a propaganda, which is the propaganda comes more from Chinese Cultural Revolution part, which I will talk about in the next lecture. But this is a documentary which kind of is somebody studying the rural healthcare systems made at that time when the Barefoot Doctor scheme was functioning in China. So if you are interested, I would suggest that you study that documentary. The first lecture ends here. What I have done here is just to introduce the Barefoot Doctor scheme in China, give you some glimpses of how they functioned, what the scheme was, and what it tried to achieve. And then in the next lecture, I will talk about more about to see and understand whether the Barefoot Doctors is entirely a product of cultural revolution or there is a future of the Barefoot Doctors in other modes of healthcare systems that we are faced with in experimenting with new modes of healthcare systems that we need to provide healthcare for a much larger population. If healthcare is to be for everyone, whether we need such decentered, pragmatic modes of healthcare conditions, which are cheaper and more easily available to a larger section of the people. Okay, thank you.